Well, we looked at critical path CPM, and that's how we can sort of keep track. Like maybe people say, well, we don't know if we can start that immediately. That's okay because we've got a float, we've got some slack time. Let's now take a look at Gantt and PERT charts, very, very common project management tools. Here's an example of a Gantt chart. It's actually a really simple example. This shows our project schedule at a glance. And you have something called a work breakdown structure. And so you might have this collection of activities. So we have this work breakdown structure, WBS1, and then we can have like the total view of all of the activities inside. So the summary of number 1 is created by activity A, B, C, D, okay? And so we can see here that this whole thing will take from week 1 up to week whatever it is, week 10 or week 15 or whatever. And the nice thing about this is that it often can use shading to tell us how much is actually done. So I can see here, and I probably wouldn't have chosen these colors, but I can see that the black part is we're that much done, so we're 57% complete, but the blue, we still have this much left. And so within this summary of element 1, this one grouping of activities, I've got activity A that's this far done, so it's 75% complete. I've got activity B, which is 67% complete, activity C, which is 50% complete, and activity D, not started at all, 0%. You can also see with these little red arrows the relationship of one activity to another. So like activity A and B can start together, but C can't start until B is done. And then C can go ahead and start, and D can start at the same time, and when they're both done, then C and D are done, and that part is done. What's nice about this is not only the shading, but you can also have a movable today line. So I can look today and I can go, oh, we're really far behind in a lot of things, and then kind of adjust our resources to try to deal with that. And then we can also see that maybe the work breakdown structure number 2 with activity E, F, G, those were supposed to have started when activity B was done and activity C started. D and E and F were all supposed to start, and they haven't started at all. So this is the concept of the Gantt chart. Moving along, how far are we, and what's the relationship of each activity in sort of a linear scheduled approach, and you can just look down at the breakout. The PERT chart here, and PERT charts are used a lot with CPM. This is done a little differently. It looks kind of like a CPM, doesn't it? But it's not exactly the same. These points, like 10, 20, 30, these are actually milestones. They're not activities. So they're like starting points or ending points. So, and when you do them, you usually just increment them by tens. So point number 10, 20, 30, 40. And then that allows you to slip in 15 or 16 if you need to. And so when I see my starting point of the whole thing, starting point number 10, I then see 2 activities. The activities are marked by arrows. So the activity is an arrow. So I have down here, I have activity A, which will take 3 months. And when you estimate the time or you grant amount of time, you can either have, this is the most likely time, the most optimistic, or the most pessimistic amount of time. And so activity A will take 3 months and get us to milestone number 30. And milestone number 30 could be an ending point and a starting point for something else. These accomplishments, these events, these numbers here, which they call them events, they don't actually take up any resources or time. They're just a point that we reach or that we start from. And so starting point number 10, 3 months on activity A, 4 months on activity B, it'll get us to points 20 and 30. When we hit point 30, 30 branches out to 2 new activities, activity D and E. Activity D will take a month, activity E will take 3 months. When D is done, we get to point 40, and then we can start another one. When all of these are done, we're finally at some kind of finish point. We're at point 50 here. So this is the idea of the PERT chart. We have these sequentially numbered events, which are basically starting and stopping milestone points. And we can see that the events are linked by arrows that represent activities with time. And we can't start a new activity until we finish the previous activity. You can see from looking at all of these things that you really need need to plot out from every single step, what's it going to take to get from here to here? And that's part of the whole project management process. Not just kind of like glossing it over. What actually does it actually take, to the day, to the hour? If it takes to write this document, if we know that it takes X amount of time, pad it if you've got the time, or put in more resources. Don't ever go always on the most optimistic. One thing as a project manager you're going to run into is the customer is always going to be like, well, hurry it up. What's taking so long? Why is it costing more? Because they didn't want to hear how expensive or how long it would take in the beginning. And part of your job is going to be to set an expectation so that they understand. And what you don't want to do is just kind of always give them the most optimistic thing, and then we run into trouble later. You don't want to do that. You want to, if it's going to take this amount of time, you want to estimate it properly. If you frankly don't know, then try to do some little trial to kind of test. But I got to tell you, if you just say, okay, if we have to write 100 pages of documentation, and I know it takes me 1 hour to write a single page, therefore this is a 100-hour project. If you do a trial that's too small, you're not going to realize that the writing alone took an hour, but it took 3 hours of research and 5 hours of interviews. And so you've got to think of everything that goes into these things. And that, of course, is the thing about project management. And as an IS auditor, we're looking at these things. Did they think about all this stuff? How experienced was the project manager? How willing and cooperative were the client and the customer? How willing and cooperative were all the users? How were all the conflicts resolved? How willing and cooperative was upper management to just help bring everyone into line and say, no, folks, it's going to be like this. These are all the things we're going to look at when we look at, well, why did this thing fail? Or what's wrong with their process? Well, what's wrong with their process is that it's always under budgeted, underfunded, and people want a lot more than what they're willing to pay for. And then they find out that there are all these kinds of issues, and staff tried to hide the issues. So like I've seen situations where the client said, okay, we need a series of instructional videos to be created, and here's the budget. And so they hire a production team, and they got a project manager, and the problem is that budget's not enough. And the client doesn't understand that, well, when we get people in there to actually create these little videos, if you spend 8 hours of filming, why didn't you get 8 hours of output? Well, no. The reality is it takes, for every 1 minute you produce, it takes 2 to 3 minutes to actually do the production. So you have clients with very unrealistic expectations. Not to mention the fact you didn't give them enough budget, and when they set up, the environment was too noisy. There was a train a block away, and it was constantly making noise. It was in a light industrial area, and people were loading, and so you heard the bangings of the trucks and the pallets and the forklifts and whatever. And so you have to realize that you got to make sure that the client really understands cost and time up front, because that's going to be one of the big things they generally won't understand. And so that's the mark of good project management, being able to do that. When we talk about creating software, we have to look at different software practices and tools. And so if our project is to create some software, one of the things that in project management we'll do is, well, what is the size estimation of the software? How many lines of code is this? You know, you've got operating systems with millions of lines of code. Well, this thing has thousands of lines or hundreds of thousands of lines of code. And so we often estimate software just by lines of code. And sometimes you'll see like a term clock, K-L-O-C, thousands of lines of code. But back in the COBOL and BASIC days, that term clock or lock was popular. And also then when we're looking, we are trying to estimate complexity. There is something called function point analysis, and this is really for larger businesses and really large projects, large software projects. There's an algorithm, and we basically say, okay, what are the inputs of this software? What are the outputs? What are the interfaces? What are all the files involved? What are all the features of this thing? And they run it through an algorithm of, okay, is this thing reusable? Is it portable across different platforms? How reliable, how stable is it? And then it comes out with sort of an assessment of this thing will be simple or average or complex. So you might, in a larger environment, see function point analysis. And then with function point analysis, you'll see also feature points like, okay, when we're estimating how much effort is involved, we need to see all the features, including the interfaces that the users will interact with, the kinds of images, the kinds of files, how many screens will people see. And then from here, from all of this, we can kind of estimate how much this software is going to cost. You figure that an application developer, they make pretty good money. And they're certainly going to make a lot more money than your your business analyst. And so the cost of this thing is going to be directly related to the size of this thing, the lines of code, the number of people involved, and that's going to be directly related to the functionality and the feature set. And then also, you know, when we consider all of this, we generally take the software and we divide it up into its major modules or its features. What's the cost for each of these modules or features? And we have to worry about, okay, also, what do we do with the source code? How do we store it? How do we test it? The cost isn't just the time of the developer sitting there. It's also the cost of people testing things off to the side, as well as the developer testing things. Storage of the code, storage of the files for the code, the systems we had to stand up so that the developers had a development environment, the support people involved because we issued some laptops and now we have to put a development environment on here, and it took us 3 days to pull that environment down and make it work and get the bugs out. So I mean, there's a whole bunch of ancillary costs, not just sitting and typing. Just like, you know, if you have a writer doing documentation, it's not just the writing, it's the let me think about this, let me organize this, let me create an outline, let me research, let me find out all the details. So you got to think about all of that stuff. It's so easy to be overly optimistic or naive about cost and scope and how much time and resource it takes. And that's always a big challenge for project management. So when we're looking at project management control, we're always looking at what was the scope of this whole thing, and did we keep it reasonably within scope? I mean, projects, the scope creep happens all the time because we just didn't anticipate. What resources were involved, and what did we do to manage the risk from the beginning to the end? And so our final success criteria is, well, ultimately, was the client happy? That's really your ultimate success criteria. But also, in the overall picture, program management, how many projects do we have that are under a common management, a common budget, sort of a common schedule, that all come together to support some business need, some business unit. Then we have a concept called portfolio management, all the projects that the organization has going on at one time. And you can have hundreds of thousands going on at any one time in a really large organization. The importance or the context of the project, how it relates to the overall business strategy, and also the project objectives. Were they SMART? Were they specific, measurable, achievable? Were they relevant, and were they time-bound or time-constrained? So we need to look at all of these when we're talking about project success criteria.